I'm Ben Weiss. He's a marine robotics engineer at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. And there he works on tools to understand and protect our oceans. In September, he's going to start the master's program at MIT on sensor system and electronics. And we are all excited to learn about this work.
Thank you, Ludi, for the introduction. I am super excited to be here. I feel like I should just, by way of background, say I was at a conference, I was at Oceans 2025 last week, and that was in France. And I told Ludi, I was like, I'll be in the neighborhood. Can I come visit? And this was neighborhood enough, but I'm just really excited to be here with all of you and share a little bit about my work. If at any point you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. I'm totally happy with that. No need to save them until the end. We started the audio and camera. Okay, great. So, as Ludi said, my name is Ben Weiss, and I'm a marine robotics engineer. I studied mechanical engineering at Yale and graduated in 2020. And since then have pretty much been at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I'll tell you, before I go into sort of the scope of the talk today, I'm going to give you a bit of background about WHOI, which is what we call the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for short. But yeah, I've gotten to do a lot of really fun things and pick up all sorts of different skills as an engineer in this environment where my job is to support a really diverse range of different kinds of science and engineering projects. So this is part of the campus of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. This is the sort of downtown area, but I live in a town of 30,000 people. And so downtown is a kind of funny word for it, but WHOI is, you know, like the biggest sort of ocean science dedicated nonprofit. I thought it was in the US, but they're claiming in the world. And like I said, there's a lot of different angles that people are studying the ocean from. I won't read through these numbers, but this is just to give you an idea of the scale. And so we're about 1,100 employees, which includes both the engineering staff, scientific staff, and also all the folks who support that kind of work and make it happen. Here's a map of the US. There's New York. It's like a 6-hour drive to where the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is. It's on Cape Cod, which most people know as being like a summer vacation destination. And we're at the very southern tip of the peninsula, just across the way from Martha's Vineyard. There are 6 different scientific departments at WHOI. I think I've worked with most of them at this point, but I'm in the Applied Ocean Physics and Engineering department, along with a number of very talented engineers, some of whom have been doing this kind of work for decades and decades. And that's part of the joy of working there too. As early career engineers, I get to learn a lot from them. In addition to the departments, there are a number of initiatives that sort of weave their way across the different departments, including the Ocean Observatories Initiative. So I'm just going to start this. And this has been a long-running project that has collected oceanographic data for some time. And it is sort of a collaboration between WHOI and the University of Washington and Oregon State University as well. But beyond those scientific, engineering, and initiative-based departments, there's also all of these folks that really keep WHOI running and keep the lights on, from academic programs office, who administers the joint program between WHOI and MIT, and folks who are working on the boats and making sure we have these platforms that we can use for our oceanographic research. If you're interested in learning more about the people at WHOI from all these different departments and places, you can scan this QR code now, or I'll share a copy of these slides. And there's a really cool campaign that our communications department did to try to show you sort of a behind the scenes of like, who is it that works at this place. Also, and finally, in the sort of introduction to WHOI, even though we're this tiny little town at the end of the United States, there's like 6 different scientific research institutions that are all based in Woods Hole. And so we like to give a shout out to our other institutions as well. I think the Marine Biological Laboratory is the oldest of our collection down there. So today, my hope is to kind of give you a sampling of the different kinds of engineering projects that I've worked on throughout my 5 years or so at WHOI. It's hard to pick 3 because there's so many fun things that I've gotten to work on, but I think this gives a good sort of overall view. First one that I'm going to talk about is the reef acoustic playback system. So this is a project that I've been working on for the past, I would say, 3 years in collaboration with a team of coral reef biologists. The principal investigator is Erin Mooney, who's all the way over there on the left. And then Nadej Aoki is the PhD student. She's finishing up now, who has really been leading the effort in the time that I've been there. So I think it was about 3 years ago that Erin approached me and told me about this really cool biological hypothesis, which is that they were trying to better understand what is it that makes coral larvae want to settle somewhere, right? This is like the most important decision that larva will ever make, because it's essentially looking for a place where there's going to be a vibrant and abundant amount of life, so that when it's stuck to that rock and it's not picking up and moving anywhere, it has enough food that's falling down to feed. So the question became, how are these little larvae that are sort of swimming around in the ocean detecting the health of the ecosystem around them? And what this lab was working on was their use of acoustics and sound to do that kind of processing and decision making. Who here would say that they understand the life cycle of a coral reef or of a coral organism, just so I know how deep to go in this by show of hands? Awesome. The sprinkling. I knew nothing coming into this project. They don't cover this in engineering school, but Erin sort of explained to me that you have these adult coral animals, right, that are almost like living rocks. And in accordance with the cycles of the moon, which blows my mind, they will have these spawning events. So before the new moon, they release a bunch of, depending on the species, either larvae or gametes into the water column, which are then floating around and ultimately going through this process where they land on some piece of sandy area, or they land on a rock, and they're trying to determine, is this a good place for me to settle? That free-floating state is a short but important period, because if they get it wrong, of course, they're not going to be able to thrive. Once they do find that spot, their body completely transforms into a polyp. And that ultimately looks like, if you were to zoom into this adult coral, there's a bunch of little polyps on the surface, and that's how the sort of colonization process begins. So my job in this context was to try to help them create a system that could amplify the sounds of a healthy coral reef in degraded ecosystems. The thought went, if degraded ecosystems are quieter, and this is something that previous papers have demonstrated, they put essentially acoustic recorders in degraded reefs and then compared that with healthy reefs and saw that they're much, much louder in the healthy ecosystems. And so if we take those sounds and use a speaker to instead enhance the acoustic environment in degraded reefs, can we get more coral larvae to settle to try to boost these reefs that are struggling? So my job as an engineer was to draw up some schematics and think about how to make this system be robust, solar powered, as user-friendly as possible, and also be able to last in that environment without sort of running out of battery or needing human intervention. So it was all good engineering projects began. It was sort of a bunch of spaghetti on my desk for a while as I was trying to put together these different components. I don't know if any of you have done like any microcontroller work. Sometimes in like college, folks will use these devices in intro engineering or even like biology classes. It's basically like a little computer. It's technically a microcontroller, it's a little different, but this allows you to do things like detect analog signal levels or communicate with other kinds of sensor systems. And even though it's a tool that's used in classrooms, it's also all over places like WHOI, who are prototyping these kinds of embedded systems. And so I do like to give a pitch for that, because also if you're trying to like work with a young engineer or something and you turn them on to this stuff, it opens up a whole world of opportunity. So starting with that, then ultimately advancing to a little bit more of a complex system. And through testing, we arrived at this sort of Rev 1 prototype where we had all these different electronic components inside of a waterproof Pelican case, along with a set of batteries, which are then plugged into this solar charge controller. And then this cable goes out to a solar panel. That's our sort of electronics enclosure with all the more delicate things, including the microcontroller and some peripheral interfaces. And then this over here is what's actually amplifying the small acoustic signal that's coming out of this box. All of the files are stored on an SD card, which is also then where we're putting our log file. So this system is constantly sort of spitting out its state, whether it's playing or whether it's in sleep mode, and all that gets captured on the SD card. Getting to work at a place like WHOI as an engineer is also awesome because it means I get to go out in the field and actually see if these things work as opposed to sitting behind a desk every day. This is in the US Virgin Islands, which was one of the first place that we were testing out the system. And these field efforts are also like totally led by their students, which is kind of wild to me in this lab, but they do an amazing job of sort of orchestrating everything. So in our initial experiment, which was conducted about 3 years ago, we were able to show that on average across our tests, we were able to double the coral larval settlement rates in sites using our speaker as compared with control. So we basically had a few different experimental sites. One that was a really sandy bottom area where there was very few acoustic cues, very few animals in the area, a degraded reef that was struggling, but there's still life there, and then a healthy coral reef ecosystem. We were also then interested in how far away can we put these little cups that had free floating coral larvae and a little settlement structure inside. We were interested in how far we could get that away from the system while still seeing an effect. This diagram is also helpful because it kind of shows how the speaker is routed to the bottom of the ocean or the sea floor. And then we've also got these sets of hydrophone arrays that we're doing signal processing on to understand how the acoustics are propagating away from the system. This is what the larvae looks like when it's in its free floating form, and this is the beginning of that like transformation as it starts to settle. This is not part of my job, but the biologists, after we get these cups out of the water, essentially sit there with a microscope and basically count what percent of the larvae that had been put in the cup have settled versus are free floating versus are dead. And this is sort of the change that they're looking for, again, with the free floating on the left and the settled on the right. Just before going to the conference, I opened my small wraps factory in this building, which I'll talk about a little later, called the David Center at WHOI. And normally in our oceanographic institution, we're making like one or like two maybe of these systems because there's so much sort of cutting edge prototyping going on. So it's pretty different to be producing these at this kind of scale. But there's a lot of interest right now in trying to use these in these degraded ecosystems and kind of try to broaden and prove out the technology to other species, to other locations and other ocean ecosystems. So this is a picture I got yesterday from the team that's in the field in Hawaii, and they're collecting adult colonies that they then put in water tanks and are waiting for the moon to be, at the right phase, at which point they scoop up the larvae, put them in the cups, install the system. That's a lot of work. And of course, that's also after the many late nights that were required to make all of these. So keep your fingers crossed for us because it's a really exciting time in the project where this has gotten more advanced and I would say more professional and as far as the like engineering system is concerned, but we're curious to see how these biological questions pan out as we get to test these different cases. If you're interested in learning more about this work, there's both a number of scientific publications on it that are out, one that's has been submitted, and then there's also some stuff on IEEE and other news sources as well. Okay, that was project number one. This next project is in a completely different domain. So my boss's name is Robin Littlefield. He's also in the Applied Ocean Physics and Engineering department. And our lab is broadly interested in this question of sort of climate solutions. How can we as engineers help to either mitigate the impacts of climate change or also better study its effect on the environment around us? The reason why this picture is sort of the backdrop of this project, which was branded Feather by our branding department. I actually came downstairs one day and like saw this poster in our building. It was like, that's a really cool poster. I wonder what that's about. And this was in front of it, so I knew it was our project. But anyway, the reason why this landscape is there is because a lot of our oceanographic sensing and experiments happen in these really remote locations where solar panels are great, but they aren't always going to cut it as far as being an energy source. Say you're in a really northern latitude in the winter time, or you're in a really hostile environment. where there's ice floating around and whatnot. So the question became, how can we maybe use wind energy in a way that allows our system to be more robust to these hostile environments and also bring energy to places that otherwise, don't have a power outlet or an easily accessible source of power. So Robin came up with this idea to have a vertical axis stowable wind turbine. So instead of being a more traditional windmill style model, this has 3 blades that are on this actuated system. This is still technically prototype, but what you would see as we finish this is that the idea is that this will be in the deployed state, generating power as long as there's sufficient wind. If there is too little wind or there is too much wind, like say in a storm event, and we want the system to sort of protect itself and stay in a kind of sleep mode, then it'll scrunch itself up and then sink down into a protective tube. We are primarily interested in at first putting this on floating structures like buoys that again have oceanographic instrumentation connected to them. But at this conference, I was just talking to some folks who do their work around Sicily, and we were talking about how this kind of tool could be really useful for also rural coastal communities that again don't have access to these to power that is necessarily dependable. My job in this particular project was to integrate the electronics and sort of deal with the smarts of the system. So that was both from a controls perspective. How do you like sample the wind speed and determine whether you want to close this thing up or deploy it? But then also there's an element that's really novel, which is that it's an actuated system as far as the windmill is concerned as well. What I mean by that is that in addition to being a generator, this is also like a motor that has a motor controller attached to it. So the analogy I generally use for this is like, that thing on the playground where it's sort of like a carousel and you've got like 3 kids standing on it and someone's pushing it from the outside and it sort of spins around. Well, the system sort of works like that in the sense that these blades are most effective when they're spinning at a particular regime or a particular ratio with respect to the wind speed. But the wind is variable and often quite low. And so what we do is we give it a shove essentially to ensure that the blades are spinning at the optimal speed with respect to whatever the ambient wind speed is. So we are putting energy into the system to ultimately maximize efficiency to get more energy out than we would otherwise if this thing was just left to kind of rotate passively. This is technically a video, but we'll see if that works. Yeah. So this is while we're testing the actuation part, it's really going really fast, and it's probably not how fast it would spin in real life, but this was while we were kind of stress testing the electronics, the motor controller, and the different parts of the system. So that project and the coral reef one both really relied upon the David Center that I mentioned before. This is both our rapid prototyping space with like 3D printers and laser cutters and water jets, but it also has this shop. You can kind of see it in the background here, which again, this is where like the people resource really comes into play. So I showed up out of college having like, spent a lot of my time in calculus class and physics, like not really knowing how to put things together. And the people in this shop have been, again, building oceanographic instrumentation for decades. And so it's a really important asset to have those folks on hand to be able to prototype with, solve problems, and then ultimately they also are a manufacturer, right? So they can build up these instrumentation components. All right, before I go on to the next one, are there any questions? So this, I am also trying to keep this moving along because I understand it's Friday afternoon and that's a beautiful day. The last project I'm going to talk about in depth is actually a few different elements, but is all around automating kelp farming. The kelp and seaweed industry is rapidly expanding in the US right now. I think the global market is projected to be like worth $25 billion in a few years from now. But the problem for kelp farmers in the United States is that they have these relatively small operations, and the process of growing seaweed is really manually labor intensive. And so you have these farmers that are trying to access this growing global market, which would require their farms to scale beyond their capacities. So we're working with a team of folks that are on the biology side at WHOI of kelp farming to create a set of tools to try to break those bottlenecks and enable farmers to grow more seaweed at scale. I had the pleasure of presenting this at Alga Europe in 2022. I didn't realize there were like entire conferences dedicated to seaweed, but it was a really awesome opportunity to talk to some folks that are at the top of the field. This is a little bit of kelp farming 101. So this structure is called a catenary array system. Essentially, you have a set of horizontal ropes going like that. And then you've got what are called grow lines that are strung in between these two sets of lines. So here you can see that's the catenary, and then these are the grow lines stretching this way. In traditional kelp aquaculture, the way that you plant out your baby kelp is it's grown on this PVC tube with a very fine piece of twine wound around it. And that's called seed string. Essentially, the kelp sporophytes are applied to that line and then grown out in the laboratory. Then you go with your boat. They've obviously already planted, but you go with a boat and you go back and forth across your farm over and over again, sort of holding these PVC pieces of tubing over the side of your boat, and just ultimately driving for kilometers and kilometers, as you can see how that would add up. This is also a really critical part of the process in the sense that the earlier you get your kelp in the ground, rather than the water rather, the more you're going to grow because it's going to have a longer time to grow. But the sea is a very variable place. So if you have a day or a week or a month where the sea state is just consistently bad and your farmer has to delay that planting process, going to significantly decrease their yields at the end of the season. The final piece of the sort of challenge of the current state of the art is that the sporophytes are really fragile and they can actually be killed by freezing air temperatures. And farmers in the States, at least, are planting during the fall where it's very cold up in Maine and Alaska. And so those freezing air temperatures can kill your sporophytes, which means that farmers are potentially putting dead seeds into the water like from day one, which is also going to be reducing their yields. So again, this work was in collaboration with my supervisor, Robin Littlefield, and he came up with this idea of what if we could use a robotic system to keep the spools underneath the water at all times and thus above freezing temperatures, and also to eliminate the need for the boat to go back and forth across the farm. Robin showed me this sort of PowerPoint diagram. There's like nothing inside of this picture. It's just sort of to talk to funders, right? And that kind of thing. And my job is to like actually figure out like what are the pieces of this system? How do you put it together? What are the electronics that are needed? So on and so forth. So we started sort of piecing things together. There's a company called Blue Robotics that does really awesome off-the-shelf hardware for anyone who's like either in oceanographic stuff or trying to get into it. And so these are a couple of their enclosures that we connected with some custom 3D printed systems, and then also a little bit of machined hardware as well. This was, I think, a couple of years ago, what our prototype looked like at the time. But essentially, it's two of those Blue Robotics thrusters, and then two of their enclosures all contained in the system. And then back there, you can see what the PVC tube looks like. There's nothing planted on this one. It was just for sort of mechanical testing. But the idea is that all the electronics and the batteries live inside of that, and then this string spools out behind it. Okay. This next video is sort of showing in that test tank how the system moves across the line. You can see how the seed string is sort of left behind, and this is hypothetically one of those grow lines. The next video is like a little nauseating if you get motion sick, because it's from the perspective of the robot itself, but it's cool because you can actually see like the green stuff on there is the baby kelp, but you can only like watch that for so long. So this system we've gotten to test both in Alaska and then more locally in Connecticut. And then just recently, we actually sent it off to Namibia, where Kelp Blue tested it really extensively and got us a ton of feedback on how to make this system more robust and user-friendly. If you have any kelp farmers in your contacts, we're basically still in the phase where we're trying to send this out to people for free, just in exchange for their insights. We've also started to expand the different kinds of systems we're making to support the kelp industry. So in addition to this automated line seeder, we've developed a micro photobioreactor, which accelerates the process of amplifying the biomass of the parent stock that's ultimately used to seed these tubes. And we continue to work on other technologies trying to tackle this. I should have said this at the beginning of this section, but zooming out for a second in terms of why do we care about growing seaweed anyway? It's a really exciting sea vegetable for the reason that like once you put it into the ocean, you do nothing. There's no fertilizer, there's no fresh water, there's no topsoil. All these things that in classic style of land agriculture are really important resources, some of which require tons of carbon fuels to produce. And so it's being looked at this green opportunity where you can grow this thing once it's in the water for free, right? But getting it into that space is really challenging. Kelp is being used for feeding humans, animals, as a biostock for creating biofuels. And then it's also used as a food additive and everything from like toothpastes to cosmetics and then actually edible things for thickening quality. Should have said that at the beginning, but like I was saying, there are tons more projects that I've gotten to work on over the past 5 years. And no matter what area of science you're in, I'm really curious to get to talk to you and hear more about what you're into, because chances are there's probably a project somewhere that, I don't know, I've gotten to learn a little bit about what you do. And so just this year, we developed these heart rate monitors for baby seals. That was a really cool project that I'm not going to go into. And then there's also, this was a deep sea zooplankton sampler that was basically like a vacuum for zooplankton. I was working with a biologist who was taking a lot of those off-the-shelf components, plus a bunch of things I 3D printed and threw together to collect zooplankton in places using alvin, which is our human submersible, in ways that people had never done before. You don't want to talk about that. I'm happy to say more about like what's it like living and working in Woods Hole, or cooking, gardening, and ceramics are also on the table. But other than that, I'm happy to take questions. Thanks for listening.
Water.
That was like simultaneous, but yeah, go ahead.
You really have a lot of fun.
Mhm.
I was curious about the first project. Do you know if was there any frequency or any signal that was particularly attracting these larvae, or you just with the whole full spectrum of?
It's a great question. Yeah, so right now we're still just playing. This lab has like one of the longest standing continuous recordings of these coral reefs, of the like healthy ones. So right now we're playing the unadulterated sort of recordings, but that is like the future direction, is to understand what organisms is it in this environment that are really important for the larvae to hear. Our best guess right now is the snapping shrimp. If you've ever been snorkeling in one of these environments, you hear all this crackling. That's actually these little shrimp that are in the environment. And so it is on the lower side of the frequencies that we think that those are the most important sounds. But a future step is going to be to kind of segment that audio and play different kinds of treatments to the larvae and see who responds to what. Yeah, great question.
A wider question. How many of those instruments that you actually develop, they stay as something that is supporting science, and what proportion they arrive to the industry, or they actually are commercialized?
Good question. So pretty much all of this stuff is for science so far, but there have been a number of the projects that I've worked on that are like, we've submitted a provisional patent, or we've talked to the folks at WHOI who specialize in commercialization to kind of set that in motion. I would say the vast majority of WHOI scientists are pretty uninterested in commercialization, but some of the engineering projects I've worked on, I think that's being put in play. With the coral reef system as well, I see that as being like a down the line thing. But right now, nothing is like ready to go on the market, and it's all sort of still in the research phase.
Because I think that there may be an intermediate step, which is just selling it to other research centers around the world, because you actually do interesting things that will it be benefit for researchers in other research institutes? And maybe some way or some mechanism to show that and just to offer that, it would be interesting.
Yeah, no, I think the PIs are very open to that kind of arrangement. Like I was saying, some of these systems we're just like sending for free to people to get just their feedback because it's so vital at this stage. But I think a number of the PIs on these projects are very much open to that. Because if we were to really commercialize, you have to start a company and have the license and all that. But yes, if you either are personally interested in any of these specific technologies in that capacity or know someone who might be, it would be great to be put in touch.
Yeah, let's know about the baby seal.
The baby seal. Oh, it was such a cute project. It was also like the media picked it up like the day before Valentine's Day. Do you celebrate Valentine's Day here in the same way? Not really. It's like a big deal in America. And because it was like heart rate monitors, people were really excited. But Michelle, who's the principal investigator, was like trying to make 3 different connecting flights coming from the Sable Islands, which is this like really remote destination where it was happening. But she was doing like 2 months of research on this tiny island. I think the population was 15 when the researchers were there. And it has wild horses in addition to this abundant seal population. And she's actually interested in understanding how the relationship between the mom feeding the seal and their development of metabolism impacts their ability to dive. And so they're basically building up their ability to hold their breath for longer periods of time. And so through these heart rate signatures, she's able to better understand the baby seal's metabolism and make conclusions from there. But this was truly like a small part of a really long field effort. And they're going to go back out next year with some changes. And then also she's interested in using aerial technology ultimately to try and do this from like an IR perspective while ground truthing with the heart monitors that we developed, which are, I should also say, like I think were basketball players originally, and we just had to kind of hack them to make them equipped for the baby seals, which, yeah, I don't know, is a fun way to reuse technologies in innovative ways. Cool. Well, my email is up there. If you end up having questions or want to chat, I'm always open. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.